Hello, RSA, and welcome to a panel on election security. Elections belong to the people. It's their decision. If they decide to turn their back on the fire and burn their behinds, then they will just have to sit on their blisters. That quote was by Abraham Lincoln. Elections are critical in a free and fair society. Public trust in election infrastructure begins with understanding what the government has done with transparency and how we as citizens in the community have a role to play as well. My name is Bryson Bort. I'll be today's moderator. My full-time job, I'm the founder and CEO of a startup called SCYTHE. We'll start with introductions from our distinguished panelists, beginning with Lester.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lester Godsey. I'm the Chief Information Security and Privacy Officer for Maricopa County. I'm sure most of you have heard us in the news, but for those of you not familiar with Maricopa County, by population, we're the fourth largest county in the United States, and needless to say, 2020 was quite a year.
Cynthia?
Thanks, Bryson. My name is Cynthia Kaiser. I'm a section chief with the FBI Cyber Division, where I've been an analytic lead for election threats since 2017. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about what we saw in 2020 and how that might affect some of our expectations for 2022 and beyond.
And Geoff.
Thanks, Bryson. Happy to be here. My name is Geoffe Hale. I lead the Election Security Initiative at SCYTHE, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. I've been a part of this election security mission since 2016 and seen a lot of growth.
All right, Lester, we're going to start with you. What did you see in 2020?
Well, probably a better way of putting it is what we didn't see, which was very little. From a technical perspective, we saw a variety of different tactics applied. And one thing I want to remind the audience is that 2020 had 3 different election cycles in it. So the presidential, preferential election, the primary, and then the general election. And so over the course of the actual calendar year, we saw quite the variety of attacks. And so we saw your typical port scanning, we saw DDoS attacks, we saw a number of different activities from a social media perspective, and really everything in between. But I would definitely say that from a 2020 perspective, one of our biggest challenges and what came to the forefront was challenges around misinformation and disinformation from a social media perspective. That in itself really was a game changer from our perspective here in Maricopa County, for sure.
Cynthia?
So I hope folks have been able to go and read the ODNI report and the report from the Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security. And that goes into a lot of detail about what we observed during the 2020 election cycle. But for me, I hope there's kind of 3 takeaways people take from those reports. One is the unprecedented way that federal, local, state, election officials, private sector, and the public all work together to be able to understand what was going on across all of the election systems. And that really gave us confidence in the conclusions that we came to in those reports. It allowed us to have a transparent feeling about what had occurred and understand the information that was going into all of those. Second is we have no evidence, not through our collection on foreign actors themselves, not through our monitoring of voting systems, not through our audits after the fact, not through any other means that foreign or other actors sought to manipulate election results. And then third, though, so we didn't see the adversaries kind of go after the ballot box, but we saw them try to influence our minds, really with an aim towards destabilizing society. And they did that through a variety of means. The actors, mainly from Iran and Russia, were amplifying content they already found on social media, creating new content, going through intermediaries, trying to intimidate voters directly, post-election, trying to intimidate the election officials and exacerbate tensions further. And I think really then, looking towards, what we can learn from that then is really how much of a whole of society effort all of this is. And that goes towards government officials who need to be having the regular information sharing with election officials and giving indicators of compromise and doing the public service announcements. That goes to the private sector, who are pointing folks to verified sources of information and taking down content that violates their terms of service or flagging the different cyber campaigns they're seeing. But it goes to the public, it goes to everyday Americans, where, we all have to be better consumers of the media that we're taking in, the information we're taking in, and critically evaluate information we're taking in and go out and seek those verified sources. So, really looking at kind of those three takeaways from what we saw in 2020, I come down to thinking through, how much work we all are continuing to do and need to do in this space to, make sure that we aren't feeding into any adversary campaigns.
Yeah, specifically, the report you were mentioning was the Foreign Threats to the 2020 U.S. federal election, published by the National Intelligence Council on the 10th of March.
That one, as well as on the 10th of March, there was, or shortly after, there was one published by the Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security that talked about the impacts to infrastructure and provided recommendations as well.
Excellent. Geoff?
So Cynthia makes some great points about the 2020 election having far more security safeguards and capabilities in place than any election beforehand. Never have we had the same level of information sharing pushed down to state and local election officials, pushed to their private sector partners. Never have we had this level of scrutiny on an election. And it's important to say that even though this was a model election, we had two APT actors present. This ODNI report describes both Russia and Iran being active on election infrastructure, being active in social media, in disinformation and influence campaigns. This kind of starts the new normal for what threats and risks on election infrastructure are. We saw the playbook in 2016. It evolved in 2020. We're going to have to be ready for it in elections to come.
So, Lester, Geoff just talked about how information sharing has improved. And as we've spoken before this panel, there's been a large shift from what we saw in 2016. And you couched that in what we've seen versus what we haven't seen in your response. Do you feel at your level that the federal government was really providing you the information that you needed?
Short answer is absolutely. So traditionally, from my perspective, years past, it used to feel like information sharing was more or less one way, to be honest with you. And so I think, and again, I started to see a shift in general, election aside, with regards to the formation of CISA as part of DHS. So we started seeing a more collaborative fashion. And then on top of that, we've seen additional collaboration with our partners at the FBI, actually Secret Service as well, et cetera, et cetera. But specific to the 2020 elections, we just saw it was a night and day difference in terms of intelligence sharing. So in the case of Maricopa County, we basically created specialized playbooks specifically around the elections. And a big portion of that playbook not only was our tactical or technology-based response to things that we would see, but also the communication protocol. So in our instance, day of election and actually leading up to it, we utilized portions of our playbook, especially around social media monitoring. And then we were reporting what we were seeing internally within the organization, and then passing that along to our fusion center here, which then obviously disseminated that information to our federal partners. But for example, day of general election, we started at 5 a.m. reporting on an hourly basis, general activity that we saw. That also included social media, because one of the things that we discovered from an intelligence perspective is social media not only was a source of intelligence with regards to cyber activity, but some of those things that we observed might translate into kinetic events as well, protests, things of that sort. And then just to get to the heart of your question there, Bryson, to Jeff's point, we actually saw day of evidence of one of these advanced persistent threat groups. And so then out of cycle, then we'd communicate that accordingly. And so we were in contact with the FBI that day to validate what we had seen versus what they had seen in other regions in the United States. So it was very collaborative. It was excellent. And honestly, in terms of communication, that's been the most collaborative effort I've ever been involved in.
And Geoff, this speaks a lot to where we've seen a strategic shift in CISA over the past couple of years. Can you talk about more about that?
Thanks, Bryson. Yeah, really one of the biggest impacts we were able to have was by funding the establishment of the EISAC, or the Election Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Center. This was really a recognition that there's like a tailored need for the protection of election infrastructure. So getting those to getting all 50 states signed up for that, and then pushing our focus down to how to help local election jurisdictions. Really, that's where elections are run and administered. It's easier to talk about elections as all 50 states, but when you really think of 8,000 jurisdictions and the individual needs and changes of each of those jurisdictions, we get to start to recognize the relationship at that level and start to tailor our services of how we can provide value to those election officials. We focused on sure, the cybersecurity services that CISA is known for: cyber hygiene, remote penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, risk and vulnerability assessments. But a lot of it was more, how do we focus on incident response planning? How do you identify an incident? Who do you need to tell? Where are you getting assistance if you're a local jurisdiction? We'd go through scenario-based planning, exercises. That's where a lot of the value that I think CISA was able to provide. Just having those relationships, being arm in arm with FBI and local FBI offices as we present a unified federal government to our state and local partners.
Well, Cynthia, Lester also gave your organization a shout out there. If you could expound on that a little bit more.
Yeah, happy to. And I think Lester made some really good points about information sharing being better both ways. So I think the federal government, FBI, CISA, we're pushing information out to election officials. At the same time, I think we were getting a lot of information in from election officials, and that made everybody safer. So, really, I think the majority information we were even able to push out to network defenders was because, local or state officials saw something, thought it looked suspicious, contacted the FBI, contacted CISA, and then we were able to get that out further and say, here's something that you need to watch out for. But, in terms of, how FBI was really involved in this, I think, the partnership with CISA and CISA, how, they worked with us, it was just so close and such an easy relationship because we had such a clarity of mission in what we were trying to accomplish. And, we were on the calls with CISA and election officials every other week, talking to them, having various other meetings when we needed to or when threats arose. And I think all that collaboration made all of us better. We understood from the FBI perspective what we actually needed to push to them. And they understood, when we're using certain language or getting this information out to them, it means, this is information that's actionable and needs to be taken on board. I'd highlight one particular policy that the FBI spearheaded in early 2020, which is the where we mandated anytime there was a local election incident that the chief state election official was also notified. And, CISA, has as an additional policy that mirrors that. And so anytime there was these local election, potential incidents, CISA and FBI were going to the chief state election official, so the Secretary of State or equivalents, and talking to them about what was happening. And I think that really gave everybody confidence after the election that, those chief state election officials knew what we knew and could make decisions and make their certifications accordingly.
Okay, now the tough question for the panel. We've talked a lot about foreign threat and influence. We briefly touched about the fact that there was some domestic. So the hot button topic of disinformation, which we've seen both foreign and domestically, and we still see the continued effects of domestic disinformation with thoughts on the election, which is a large challenge for us. So I'm not going to put anyone on the spot yet. Who wants to be first to jump into domestic versus foreign disinformation and what can be done at different levels? I see Lester with his hand raised. Lester, you're up.
So maybe I can kick this off, and then our federal partners can kind of add some flavor to it from a national perspective. Social media disinformation and misinformation was a game changer for us. And I would go so far as to say, from a government perspective, moving forward, any cybersecurity or information security teams, they should be adding this to their portfolio of services, because this is not going to go away just because the election's over, frankly. I think we're in a new era, if you will, in terms of additional threats and risks, as well as source of information for all of us. But back to the 2020 elections, we saw quite a bit of this activity, and it wasn't necessarily just your normal, if you will, or popular consumer social media platforms. We saw plenty of that. To give you an example of my statement earlier about how social media threat intelligence might translate into a kinetic event, we actually picked up intelligence on social media about people using that platform to coordinate a caravan to follow our election staff when they were moving from one location to another. And so that obviously presented itself as a risk depending on what would occur along those lines. Obviously, we saw a lot of evidence with regards to coordination and communication about protests, which obviously everybody's welcome to protest as long as it's done in a safe fashion. But another example that was really interesting, and this goes back to the intelligence sharing with our federal partners, is the fusion centers throughout the United States did an excellent job of communicating with one another, and the locals receiving that information. So we heard from a fusion center who just had made an observation about a third-party vendor who was popular in the government space in terms of government services and collaboration, if you will. And so we received some intelligence with regards to that. We determined that was a platform that we were familiar with. And so upon further investigation, we saw evidence of utilization of bots to automatically register thousands upon thousands of new users on this platform. And so we reached out to our federal partners and that vendor, and again, it's not the locals' job to articulate where the threat originated from. We just reported it. But I think that was a good example and a high degree of likelihood that we were able to circumvent a situation where that platform was being used to spread disinformation. So
I think it's often helpful to reframe this as a bit of a supply and demand challenge. We have in the U.S. government some of the most robust capabilities to degrade disinformation actors coming from foreign sources. The intelligence community, the FBI, do a phenomenal job of being able to identify and take action against the threat actors. But at some level, that's a game of whack-a-mole. You're always chasing and reacting to disinformation spreaders, and disinformation here being the spreading of false information with intent to do harm, as opposed to misinformation, where it's, again, false information without the malicious intent. So the ability to target those threat actor interventions is a great tool in the tool set, but it can't be the only thing we have. And so that addresses the supply of disinformation in many ways. But on the other side of the equation, the demand side of the equation, Americans are often searching for information. So how do you make sure that their information environment has access to all of the appropriate trusted sources of information? Election officials in the election sector for accurate day, time information about how their election is administered, what their security practices and protocols are. So we focused a lot of attention on that resilience side, that supply side, or that demand side, where how do you prevent the information environment from being overly distorted? We're not trying to stop anyone from being wrong on the internet. We're just trying to make sure that their information environment is not so broken.
Geoff, I think that brings to mind kind of the series of PSAs that CISA and FBI had done in kind of that September, October timeframe right before the election, where we were trying to get out information to the American public where you might see this or you might see these kind of false claims, and this is what it really means, and you can vote anyways, and really trying to get verified information from both our agencies out to the American public so that they could make some of those choices. I think one interesting anecdote, shifting gears for this, like thinking about domestic or foreign disinformation, is what the Iranians did during the election, because what we saw them do before the election is directly try to intimidate voters and masquerading as a domestic actor. What we saw them doing after the election is threatening the lives on websites of election officials and private sector officials or other U.S. government officials. And that too, it wasn't labeled product of Iran. It masqueraded as more domestic sources. And I know one element that both CISA and FBI tried to do is get out public service announcements to talk about, like, hey, this activity is Iran backed. If you retweet from these handles, you're spreading Iranian disinformation. And so really being able to bridge the gap of helping folks, doing information sharing to help folks understand where information is coming from, in addition to some of the activities that Geoff was talking about on the infrastructure side, I think is really the way forward in trying to look at some of these threats.
So Cynthia, I'm going to come right back at you with a difficult question. So Geoff talked about whack-a-mole, and you represent one of the agencies that actually does something outside of here to solve some of that. How can we do more? How do we, this is maybe isn't a question of deterrence, but what else can we do?
So, I think there's two sides of this, and I can let, Geoff talk through, maybe a little more of the recommendations that we've put out in some of the reports about, shoring up our election systems overall. I'd sum that up in, we're not done. We have to continue what we're doing and get better at what we're doing, to make a difference. But, I guess what I worry about is a 2022 or a 2024 where adversaries believe they can conduct these activities with impunity, that there's no consequences or risk to conducting activities that they're seeking to do. And, I think that's why Director Wray announced FBI Director Wray announced the new FBI cyber strategy in the fall that really centers on imposing risks and consequences on cyber actors. I think it's really essentially about getting some of these adversaries to think, to change their cost benefit analysis when they're thinking about doing activities in the first place, and get to the point of saying it's just not worth it. Now that's a long game. We're not going to do one thing and have that be completed, but there's ways in which every day that we're working towards that, and I think as we expand on some of those activities, we really can make a difference. One is what we've kind of been talking about: the information sharing, the hardening of networks. So adopting best practices in cybersecurity and U.S. government getting information out so that people can try to kick actors off or block them from getting on their networks in the first place. In addition, though, we need to get into this detect and deterrence framework, really, or frame of mind, to be able to make that difference. And I think some of that is detecting publicly attributing actors, like we did with Russia and Iran right before the election, like saying that if you do this, we're going to publicly out what you've done and the activities you're conducting, as well as working with partners on infrastructure takedowns or other operations to try to degrade those operations in the first place. So there's really a lot, I think, that swirls under all of that, but you can kind of put it under the banner of how do we increase the risks to doing this activity, and how do we increase the consequences?
Geoff, to add?
I think it's a great challenge. There's always going to be a segment of the population that is going to reject the message from the messenger, particularly when the messenger is the federal government. But the best that we can do in many instances is try to make sure that the information environment is not in great disorder, so that those populations that are undecided about whether this piece of information, this artifact of disinformation, is true or not, whether they have the opportunity to find better sources. So we're working with a lot of election officials on how are they tracking their information? How are they maintaining their basically standards of procedures so that they can be as transparent? How are they tracking it? How are they testing against it? And then how are they talking about it? Chris Krebs, then Director Chris Krebs, had his 3 Ps. We're trying a different letter here, but it's these 3 actions. How are you transparent about all of the security practices that you have to the point that you can engender confidence? You may not be speaking to absolutely everyone, but hopefully you're reaching the people who haven't decided to be complete rejectors of evidence here.
And then Lester, adding from the local level?
So, yeah, absolutely. And we certainly support, and obviously there are certain activities that local governments can't do. And so we have to rely upon our federal partners to assist, especially when it comes to being a deterrent. So locals can't go rogue and enact our own cyber war, of course, but we have a responsibility as well. And so one of the things that we've tried to do in Maricopa County is share amongst our other local partners with regards to our approach, our tactics, things that we've learned. For example, another example from a CISA perspective is not only have we partnered with them from a cyber perspective to take a look at what our security posture is, but also on the physical or kinetic side, we've actually had security advisors from CISA do site visits to validate the physical security from an elections perspective. And so we've consolidated all that information into specialized playbooks along those lines that address a number of different scenarios from a cyber perspective as well as communication. And even before the actual elections wrapped up, we shared that information freely, obviously sanitized, with our other counties in the United States and other organizations that Maricopa County participates in. And so we as local governments need to do collectively a better job and have a more formal, stringent process in place, especially when it comes to intelligence sharing that we follow and execute. One of the critical things in terms of what Cynthia was talking about for future elections is everybody needs to practice this. So it's one thing to have it documented, have your playbooks, but if the first time you're looking at your playbook is day of election, then that's not the right tack to take. So I'm happy to say, at least with Maricopa County, that we had multiple tabletop exercises involving a variety of different groups, including our recorder for the county, and then those playbooks and that process and communication flow. Again, as Cynthia mentioned, we'd share that information. We shared our playbooks with CISA, with the FBI, with the Secretary of State here in Arizona. And so I would encourage, in preparation for future election cycles, we need to share more information at the local level, and we need to practice what we're preaching as well too. So that way we're a well-oiled machine when it comes to the next election cycle.
Yeah, touching on something Cynthia said earlier about the fact that it's continuous. While the election security itself is punctuated by specific events of this election and making sure that we've effectively captured the will of the voter at the different levels, it's continuous. And so in the context of what we're already doing to plan for the next one, can you share a little bit more about that, as well as what we might expect from different adversarial elements?
Sure. So in the case of Maricopa County, we take a very iterative approach. And so that's what we did in 2020. So after each election cycle, we did a hot wash. We identified what observations we made during that election cycle. We factored that into whether it was updates to our playbooks. We brought on new technology. Won't go into specifics, but we brought on additional capabilities to do social media monitoring, for example. And so in our case, what we continue to do is we continue to refine our election playbooks, our general incident response playbooks, And then also our information gathering and visibility. So whether it's improving our dashboard capabilities in our SIM so that we can more quickly pivot, automate some activities so we're spending less time doing basic intelligence gathering and having that process automated. And then continuing to partner with our Fusion Center and then communicate with regards to how the communication flow was going. Are we responding fast enough? Are we able, if we can better identify what those IOCs are that are needed, et cetera, then so much better with regards to the efficiency and efficacy on how we interact with our state and the federal partners.
Cynthia?
So, you know, I think that the lesson learned for all of us was just how much we all need each other, you know, during all these election cycles. And that's really where, you know, looking towards the future, like what we really need to do, we need to keep the partnership strong. You know, we need to keep talking to each other. We can't look around and think, oh, it's, you know, June 2022, I guess we should start talking to election officials again. You know, we have to really remain committed to working with each other, to the tipping and queuing that we've had with election officials, with the private sector, continuing the conversation with the American public about what is, you know, foreign campaigns, what we are seeing coming down the pike. And I think really just solidifying the work that we've done to get us to the point this far.
Geoff?
I completely agree with Cynthia and Lester on this. There are some areas where we can continue to mature. CISA is doing a lot of work with the election vendor community on supply chain. We've seen supply chain be another theme of 2020, in addition to pandemics and ransomware and election security. It's how do we help secure the vendor supply chain for which basically much of the United States is dependent on for their elections. Beyond that, working to again support local election officials in the greatest extent possible. There's other milestones that are important. The voluntary voting system guidelines was just updated. So by 2024, there may be new systems that have additional security, particularly around auditability and software independence, that are going to be big accomplishments in the ability to secure the sector. A lot of work to do, but there's progress in about every area.
So Geoff, you mentioned the supply chain, and here we are speaking at the largest IT security conference in the world. So the question to the group, and we'll start with Lester, is what would you ask of attendees in their capacity as information security professionals, as well as that they are all respective citizens?
So yeah, that's a great question. And so I guess one of the things I would ask of the vendor community as a whole is an acknowledgement on what the ramifications are of their technology and their solution. Understanding the shift in technology and such that we have a greater and greater dependency on supply chain down the road, whether that's from an operational perspective or from an information security perspective. And so having the knowledge of where those dependencies are is critical in terms of delivering a free and fair election. And that the other thing to keep in mind too is there doesn't actually have to be an event that can cause a disruption to the election. It just has to have the appearance of an event, if that makes sense. Meaning, you know, look, there's that saying, perception is reality, right? And so we all collectively saw in 2020 that the vast majority of what was communicated, whether it's social media or even traditional media in some instances, just frankly wasn't true. But it lent itself towards giving the sense that there was maybe some impropriety. And again, as Cynthia and Geoff has mentioned, there's no evidence of that whatsoever across the board. Yet there were, you know, Maricopa County with Sharpie Gate, for example, and that wasn't a thing. And so vendors just need to take into consideration the sensitivity around their technology, especially as it relates to the elections, and how just the perception itself could be a disruption.
Cynthia?
So, when I look back on 2020, I just am so intensely proud of the men and women across the FBI who worked on this at CISA, in local and state election officials, the private sector, everyone coming together and working towards this. I mean, it was just, it's such a moment that you can look back on for the rest of your life and know that everyone in this space really gave it their all to get us to the point that we're at today. And so I'd ask kind of two things of folks attending today. One is continue to note to the FBI and to CISA when you see something suspicious so that we can investigate it, help you, and help everyone else in the space and make everyone safer. But number two is that if you've ever considered joining the fight, I think now's the time. FBI cyber is growing. We are, adding lots of different positions, and it's not just, agents and analysts, but it's data analysts, data scientists, computer scientists. I mean, you don't have to be able to run an 8-minute mile to join the FBI, right? You need to be able to help us figure out what to do with this 80 terabytes of information. But really, I think, if, folks have that interest in either working with or working for our organizations, you get to be, something, bigger than yourself. You get to really work towards, imposing the risks and consequences on these actors so that, they don't think about doing it in like the later years in these future election cycles. And, you can really beat that.
And Geoff?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with Cynthia more. It's come work for SCYTHE. This has been the coolest job I've had. The experiences and the ability to actually make a difference. And short of that, if you're not willing to do a tour with the federal government, go talk to your election officials. It took SCYTHE years to begin to understand how elections are actually run. Don't assume you know it. Talk to them. Don't pitch them services until you understand the position that they're in. And then from there, you can figure out how to help. They get a lot of solicitations. What they want is assistance.
All right, lightning round to close it out. You each have 30 seconds. You had a magic wand. What would you change in the system? Lester, first up.
I probably would change the system in such a way that there was a greater sense of confidence and transparency with regards to the whole election. And what Geoff talked about sounds pretty darn close to that. So if we can hit that stage, all we want to do is be able to provide this service to our constituents where they're 100% confident that their vote's going to be counted and it's not going to be tampered with.
Cynthia?
So I'm going to ask for two wishes. One is everything's patched. And two, though, is that Americans, understand election systems, just like kind of Geoff was talking about, just like all of us have come to learn it, more and more, because, once you learn about it, you really are able to have a lot more confidence in the conclusions coming out from, all various folks involved.
And Geoff, take us home.
The first one's easy. Auditability. We did a great job across the country. I think about 93%. Auditability. Those paper records are the evidence by which elections will be convincing. But the second is consistent funding for elections, so that they're not left in the same position, just trying to beg and scrape in order to perform the maintenance for elections that are necessary.
All right. Thank you to all of our distinguished panelists for joining us today.